Shameful encounter. The 11th of February, 2025. When you say it is the only way to peace, what do you mean? One of the men asks another while I walk into the cafe. Have you not seen how people are asking questions that do not pertain to anyone but themselves? They would not call one another anything more than what they are, human. The other man replies, I came in late this time. I sit down exhausted from work and ask for a cup of tea. I look at the screen and it seems like I missed the second courtroom proceedings. They usually go in a sequence to avoid clashes between different religious traditions. Therefore, in the morning, the judges who judge between Muslims for different cases would watch the morning courtroom proceedings. The Christians would watch the afternoon proceedings, and the Jews would watch the evening proceedings. They are all brothers, one of the men declares. I look at them startled. It seems as though he had read my mind. Then I notice that he is showing the woman next to him a picture where his children are all lined up and the youngest child is half the size of the oldest. Both the men and the woman start laughing. However, on another note, they are all brothers. All different religious traditions are followed by people who should relate to one another through the lens of brotherhood. It is only true that we all come from one single father and mother. It is only true that we should be brothers to one another. I glance at the man who spoke about peace as I walked in. He looks like a man in his 20s, speaking to a man in his 30s. There is no indication of the religious tradition any of them follow. They are both wearing casual clothes and drinking the usual drinks at a cafe. The man in his 20s says, if I were there, I would ask him whether this is the ultimate way to peace. What if there was a different way, a more human-driven way? The man in his 30s replied, so what do you suggest? We leave the matters of dispute to be resolved by human intelligence and human desires. We remember how that was implemented in our previous generations. It is no wonder we have orphans of war who had nothing to do with the war, yet they suffer its consequences. The man in his 20s said, do you mean Armageddon? Why not call it by its name rather than only the war? The man in his 30s replied, you are still young. You think we fear the name. We just do not mention it because it was a devastating event. Only people who think they've seen too much war would call any war whatever they want. This war you are referring to, which had left orphans in its wake, is not Armageddon. Thank God we still have water to drink. The man in his 20s replied, what do you mean it was not Armageddon? Everyone says it was. The man in his 30s looked at his cup of tea, contemplating whether or not to drink from it, and said, Armageddon will leave only a third of water on earth to drink. It will leave only a third of the land inhabitable. It will not only devastate the people causing the death of millions, it will have an effect on the living standards of everyone who comes after it. He drank from his cup and then looked at the other and said, you claim to want to have peace, and you claim that you know a better way for peace than the one we, thank God, currently have. Yet you call the war what other people call it without knowing the details or whether that is true or false. The war was just a war. Its magnitude caused people to freak out, thinking that it is the war of the end of the world. It is not. The man in his 20s replied, but there is a better way for peace. It is by giving the people the chance to apply the law in whichever way they see fit. We do not have to watch court proceedings and apply what we see every time. The man in his thirties replied abruptly, "You are not a judge in a courtroom who watches this every time it is streamed to the public. You are not suffering any hardship applying the law, let alone use your head to extrapolate a judgment based on what happened before. You are only watching to know how things happen transparently. If you learn how to implement something, prevent yourself from doing something, or if you learn how to judge a situation based on what you've seen the servant do, then so be it. You've had an impact. If not, then do not claim to know any better." The man in his twenties responded, "Why are you agitated? I was only suggesting. Times have changed, and we surely need a new way of government." The man in his thirties replied, "I'm agitated because you are speaking childishly. Peace is only ensured through the application of God's words, not through the application of its human interpretation. If God says, 'Don't steal,' in all the holy books, and a man comes who had stolen his neighbor's money, it is only right to apply God's law to ensure peace. Human interpretation would pronounce the person guilty and would throw him in prison. God's law says to cut off his fingers so as to deter him from stealing again. Which punishment would you go for, since you claim to know a better way to peace?" The man in his twenties replied, "I would go for the prison." "Of course you would," the man in his thirties replied, "because you think you know better than to follow the law of God. You want to base your judgment on human rights violations, which considered that it's a violation because it renders a person unable to work to make the country prosperous. Human rights did not care about peace, nor did it care about ensuring justice. It only wanted to have the workforce always present to make them more money. It is no wonder that they called for the rehabilitation of prisons, making them five-star dwellings for murderers and thieves. Is this how peace and justice is ensured?" The man in his twenties replied, "Stop attacking human rights." The man in his thirties replied, "Stop denying that peace is only ensured through the application of God's laws and punishments. If you are to learn anything from the court proceedings, it is that what we currently have is better than what we had before it." "Here's your tea, ma'am," the waitress said to me as she laid the cup on my table. "If you need anything else, just call out to me." Then she left. I put some sugar in the cup and then glanced at the screen. Only 10 more minutes until the start of the third courtroom proceeding session. I spent a lot of time commuting to the city from work. It was unusually crowded today for some reason. "Attention, attention!" A van passing by sounds through the speakers. "There will be a planned power outage in the city to enhance electricity provision during the days of winter. Be advised, the outage will start in 30 minutes. "Not again!" the waiter exclaimed. "The last time they did that, it took 3 hours to come back. These people are very slow workers." "At least we will have electricity back," the man in his thirties replied. "I better head home before this begins." Then he stood up and put on his coat. The man in his twenties replied, "Are you not going to watch the Jewish proceedings?" The man in his thirties replied, "I'm not Jewish. Why should I watch it?" The man in his twenties said, "To know the language of your enemies." The man in his thirties sat back down and said with an interrogative tone, "Your enemies?" I thought you were a proponent of peace, that you kept lecturing me about it ever since you came into this cafe. How would I know that you are not my enemy and that I should learn your own language rather than the language of the Jews? Besides, the proceedings are in accordance with the Torah and its teachings. It is the law of God, and God said that we are brothers to one another, not enemies. The man in his 20s replied, "Calm down, I was making a joke." The man in his 30s said, "You can joke about it all you want. It doesn't change the facts that we all come from one single couple. God created humans to become helpers to one another. This is the whole purpose of creating Eve for Adam, so that they would help one another and procreate to make more humans who would help one another, not to take them as enemies." He sighed, looked down to the ground, and shook his head, saying, "I wonder if people like you who watch these proceedings would be thinking like you do." He scoffed, saying, "To know the language of your enemies." Then looked at him and said, "If only you would have said to learn how God punishes transgressors, or to learn how to use God's words to ensure righteousness in the eyes of the Lord. That would have been better than calling them enemies." Nevertheless, he stood back up. "Stay here and watch how those enemies of yours are being prosecuted then. One day you will grow up and you will learn." "How old are you now? 18?" The man in his 20s replied, 23. The man in his 30s said, as he moved towards the door, "Well, you think like a teen. You still need a lot of time before you develop your logical reasoning faculties. Some Jews are more Muslim than Muslims themselves." He walked out the door and closed it behind him. "Some Jews are more Muslim than Muslims themselves," he scoffed. "How can they be more Muslim if they are not even Muslim to begin with?" Then it dawned on me. I have not been able to watch the morning proceedings because I would be at work. Could it be one of the statements that the servant had mentioned in the morning? Jews are Muslim, as we have said in both of our proceedings today. The courtroom proceeding begins on screen. Human is a word derived from the two words "hu" and "man." Hu means clay or mud or soil, and man means creature. Therefore, human means creature of clay, or a creature created from clay, mud, or soil. It means the creature made from the soil of the earth. You could hear the crowd around him speaking in agreement. "That's right. Yes." Therefore, when defining the word human, it can only be seen as a creature that is similar to all other creatures of God. A human is a creature who is created by God to dwell on the earth from which he was created. He spoke to the crowd with a reassuring tone, something that the servant does whenever he speaks about something that everyone should have already held in their belief system. The servant continued, "It is no wonder that people who had visited space in the past would feel homesick and nostalgic when thinking about Earth and about leaving Earth to live somewhere else. It is not entirely because of the social system that we built around our communities. It is not because you miss your friends and family. It is because you feel the pull towards that from which you were created. You feel the pull back to the soil of the earth. They feel homesick because Earth is where they should be and not outside of Earth. They needed to come back." Well, this does not seem to be true for those who have already departed Earth and started living outside, in the habitats that were designed by those giant space companies. It is said that there are people still living in those abandoned space habitats around Mars. The servant continued, humans were created to tend the fields of earth and graze animals. When God created everything in the world, including every planet in the cosmos, He designated Earth as a dwelling for all living creatures. This is why there is no life on any other planet. God put humans to take care of all living creatures because life for God is precious. He stepped down to the platform in front of his desk and said, had there been life outside of Earth, God would have created humans there as well to tend to that life's needs. Humans were created as vice-regents of God. They would spend their limited lifespan tending and caring for all creatures that have the breath of life in them. This is exactly what it meant to be given a task by God. A man stood up from among the crowd and began to speak out. We were created to act as. Then the man stumbles as though his mouth stopped working, as though his tongue was locked in place. It reminded me of what happened to the man yesterday, but this is different. The man continued to moan out of pain. Then he put his hands on his throat. The servant, looking at the man, shook his head and said, "Did I not tell you not to blaspheme God?" Then he went back to his seat and, looking down at the paper in front of him, then looking up at the man, he said, "No, we are created beings. Even our own souls are created. Therefore, we cannot be creators. We are not to act as the creator. We are merely tasked with preserving life rather than taking life." As soon as the servant said these words, the man voiced out a groan of relief, getting back his ability to speak. The servant said, "God is quick to punish those who intend on blasphemy. He does not allow blasphemy, especially the type which led our generation as well as the generation before us to be subject to God's destruction." He looked down and said, "You keep taking it lightly if you want. As God states, one day you all will know." The first case today, the servant continued, was a spontaneous attempt at blasphemy. You all have witnessed its consequences. Inability to speak as though your mouth is stamped with a seal by God, preventing you from uttering the next word which would cause your own demise. Is it not by the mercy of God that you were shut right up to prevent a scene on public screens? Is it not by the mercy of God that He gave you respite by making you hold the word of blasphemy in your mouth until you are explicitly informed of its severity? He looked up at the crowd and said, "Henceforth, blasphemy is not tolerated in any courtroom on earth." Then he nodded to the note-takers. A barrage of questions started formulating in the midst of our cafe. People started asking with a furious tone, "What?" all around. One of the men laughed and said, "This serves us right. Blasphemy should never have been within the boundaries of free speech anyway." Another man replied to him, "Does this mean anyone who blasphemes?" The man interrupted, "Yes, yes, any person who dares to do so would become mute. Then he might even die on the spot. Are you not paying attention?" The other replied, "But this is dangerous. How can that be legal?" I responded, "Legal in the eyes of whom? Are you still relying on legal action that a government would take? This is about God, and blasphemy of God should never go unpunished. It is God's rightful right to do it on the spot or to delay it until the person is more informed. Are you saying it is not legal for God to punish those who would blaspheme Him?" The man replied, I'm not saying that, but it happened so suddenly that it looks very staged to me. I reply, it is not staged. Yesterday, someone tried to insult the servant and had a similar thing happen to him. The man said, are you saying that insulting the servant is equivalent to blasphemy? I replied, it is not. All I'm saying is that it is not within the power of the servant to prevent the blasphemer from speaking. It is done by God, and He chooses how to apply His justice and how He sees fit. The servant is only a tool for peace among the religions, if not for anything else. I picked up the teacup and concluded my statement saying, if you blaspheme God, you die. This is a fair punishment in my opinion. The servant calmed the crowd down by saying, do not be afraid. This is a specific part of human psyche, which would cause anyone to lash out at the person who unjustly devalue a certain thing the person holds dear. In this case, had this man spoken the words of blasphemy, it would be justified for me, personally, to lash out at him, attacking him, even physically. It is a justified action. However, it would not be ensuring a peaceful exchange. Instead, it would cause distress and chaos within the courtroom. This means that it was a merciful punishment, even though it was for a small period of time that this man was held in silence. The servant looked back at the podium and said, on the day of judgment, God will seal up the mouths of anyone who disbelieved in Him in their lives. God would not allow them to speak, nor to negotiate their cases with Him. They would be made mute, unable to speak a word. Then he looked at his hands and said, these will be the ones to speak. Your limbs would be the witnesses against you, telling God everything exactly as it happened. The servant then sat down in his desk and asked the crowd, you can lie about your cases here, today, in your earthly lives, but do you think you would be allowed to lie in front of God? Do you think He would allow you a chance to try to escape His punishment? The servant looked at the guards and said, let's take number 26. The guard moved to a man in the second row to call him up to the podium. However, he looked back at the servant and said, he cannot speak. The servant said, what about number 27? The guard checked the man next to him, stood him up, and led him to the podium. The man said immediately, the man before me was able to speak when we came in. The servant said, yes, but it seems like it was not the time for him to speak. What is your case? The man replied, my mother died. When he started speaking about his case, the electricity went off. If punishment for blasphemy is immediate, do you think that would make our world a better place? I think that there is a very good reason why punishment for blasphemy is deferred until God commands that it be applied. Is there repentance for that sin? If God does not punish it instantly, then it means there is still time to repent. So yes, it can be repented from if God forgives it. The issue of electricity going off has been a thing of a burden for a lot of the citizens these past couple of years. It is getting better and less frequent, yet it still shows up as an issue. In some cases, I wonder whether the court proceedings would be sufficiently relayed through the newspapers or the periodic citywide announcements that happen every month. Last month, the announcements contained over 20 specific sentences. It appears to be an issue that is only caused due to the citizens' obliviousness to the law. Why would someone go into a public courtroom to receive a sentence or a punishment in front of other people when they can just as easily read about the sin and its sentence prescribed in the Holy Book? Showing up in the courtroom just makes it a public sentence. Many people would claim, just as they have always claimed, that they cannot understand the words of God, or the sentence, and its means of atonement. But then again, how would relaying the issue in front of other people help? If people struggle with a specific issue, why not read the Holy Book rather than ask the servant, or any judge for that matter, for a ruling about this issue? To me, it just seems like our generation is still as ignorant as our forefathers have been. We think that other people are more knowledgeable because of their experience with the law, and by doing this, we minimize our own understanding and capacity for knowledge. How long will electricity be off? Do you know? I asked the waitress when she passed by my table. I don't know, ma'am. I think it will be well over 2 hours. She answered with a smile, carrying a candle to put on my table. I will not be staying then. Thank you for the tea. I reached into my bag to pay for my tea. Please keep the change. Thank you, she said as she took the money and then she moved away. A woman spoke to her husband, saying, "You don't know what anyone has in their hearts. You only know what they say to you." Then she pointed to the screen and said, "Had electricity not been off, we would have seen the man whose mother died explaining a whole different scenario than the one you blatantly described to me." The husband said with a quiet voice, "Please, lower your voice. We don't want people to speak about us." The woman said, "This is all you care about, what people think and what people say. What if they speak about us? It doesn't matter. You have to be courageous enough to let them know what you've been telling me. Or are you afraid they might think you're imposing?" The husband answered, "I said lower your voice. I don't care what people say, but I do not want this to turn into another one of your baseless arguments." The woman replied, "Baseless arguments? You said that the blasphemer should not have been able to voice out his opinion because God knows your heart and what you intend before you do it. If he did not begin his statement, we, humans, would not understand why he became unable to speak to begin with. Therefore, we would not have taken the hint. How is that a baseless argument?" The husband spoke with a louder voice, "How do I fit into this argument of yours? What is it to me?" The woman replied, You said the man would not be able to speak from the beginning of his statement. This means that we would not be able to benefit from the interaction." The husband said, "You do realize we are watching a live stream of actual events that are happening immediately as we see them, right? It could not have been that well thought out as you explain. It had to have had that purpose from the very beginning." The woman said, "You are exactly right. It had to have that purpose from the beginning. We are all living in the world as though we are living in a play. Everything we do already has a purpose that God ordained prior to creating everything. He had planned all of this to happen. This is why if he had struck the man before he said anything, we would not learn anything from the incident. So, God waited until the man said enough to carry the point across, and then shut the man up before committing the sin." The husband said, "I agree. My argument is that the man was supposed to weigh his argument beforehand and determine whether what he was going to say was a sin or not." The woman shook her head and gasped for air, then said, "Well then, there would be no lesson to be learnt." Do you think people think about their arguments and what they plan on saying all the time before saying it? Had that been the case, we would not have needed people who would guide our moral compass throughout the ages. We would all be careful enough that we would avoid sin on a daily basis as a habit rather than need corrective measures. The husband explained, "Corrective measures were put in place for us to use to correct our ways. They are supposed to be considered a given in a world that has to run by the rules set by God. Religion allows for such measures to be generalized and used in multiple occasions, even when it does not pertain to religion." The woman said, "You cannot know whether or not a person is going to say something in particular or not say it. You cannot determine whether a person believes or not. You cannot know what the heart contains unless the person speaks. This is why we are required to speak to one another, to know what we feel and what we think." The husband replied, "But sometimes holding your tongue in a public place and waiting until we get back home would be the best course of action. Instead, you lash out at me and start labeling my arguments a baseless argument when in fact it holds some truth to it, even if you do not see that truth immediately." The woman replied, "Sometimes I wish you would keep your ideas to yourself rather than share them with me. You are giving me a migraine." The husband responded, "You are giving yourself the migraine. It is not my fault you can't manage your temper." I laugh as I hear these words that they both look at me from the corner of their eyes. I feel so guilty that I quickly pick up the cup of tea and drink all that's left in it, then carry my bag and storm out of the cafe. I hope they will not remember my face tomorrow, I say to myself as I close the door behind me.